When Charlemagne was crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, a patchwork of warring tribes and tiny kingdoms suddenly had someone trying to stitch them together, politically, legally, and culturally, like a very determined tailor with a sword. That crown didn't just make a headline, it set up schools, roads, coins, laws, and a shared idea of Europe that still echoes today. Think of Charlemagne as an early CEO who standardized the rules across messy branches. He hired teachers, fixed the money so merchants could trade without squabbling, and pushed for laws everyone could actually follow, basic stuff we take for granted, like paying taxes that make roads and schools possible. Medieval just means Middle Ages, the time after Rome when Europe was figuring itself out, kind of like rebuilding a town after a huge party, but with more armor and fewer pizza deliveries. Watch to discover 3 surprising ways Charlemagne touches your life now: the languages we speak, the schools kids attend, and even some of the borders on your map, plus a few dramatic stories, a Christmas coronation that shocked the world, a pope with an ego and a plan, and a ruler who loved books almost as much as conquering. It's history with politics, personality, and a pinch of medieval drama, no Latin degree required. Early life and Frankish roots. Born into the Carolingian household as the son of Pepin and Bertrada, Charlemagne entered a world where family ties and military skill carried real weight. He grew up alongside brothers and cousins who were both companions and rivals, learning early that leadership meant constant negotiation as much as battlefield courage. The royal court where he lived mixed ceremony with straightforward practicality. There were feasts and prayers, but also training sessions in horsemanship and weapons, and quick decisions about who would govern which town or army. Frankish society itself had deep Germanic roots but used many Roman habits too, so life felt like a recipe mixed from 2 old cookbooks. Warriors swore loyalty personally to a leader, handing over their service in return for land or privileges. In simple terms, if you fought for the boss, you got a plot of land or a steady income. Think of it like getting paid partly in rent-free housing instead of a paycheck. It kept people close to the ruler and made loyalty tangible. Hospitality mattered as well. Guests were expected to be fed, sheltered, and treated with respect, and insults could lead to feuds rather than polite complaints. Clerics and educated men had strong influence in his upbringing, and Charlemagne's early life included instruction from church teachers alongside practical lessons. He learned to ride hard and to command a group of men, skills that are taught today in boot camps and leadership seminars, only with more spears and less paperwork. Contemporary writers noted that he was better at speaking and listening than at writing his own name neatly. He preferred action and memory to filling in forms. This practical bent made him a leader who relied on trusted advisors and on clear, quick orders. The Frankish mix of Roman administration and Germanic customs shaped his instincts for rule: keep roads and taxes working, reward loyal followers, and bind the church into your plans. Alliances through marriage and the granting of lands were tools he learned young, like a modern manager who builds teams through promotions and favors rather than memos. Humor helped at court too. A sharp story at the right moment could smooth tensions just as a well-timed promise of land could win over a wavering noble. These early roots made him into a ruler who combined warrior energy, organizational sense, and a knack for bringing different traditions together. The rise of the Carolingians. Power in the Frankish kingdoms shifted quietly at first, moving from the ceremonial kings to the men who actually ran the households and armies. These men were the mayors of the palace, essentially the chief steward who managed the court, finances, and military logistics, and over time they became the ones making big decisions while kings kept the fancy robes. Think of it like a company where the founder keeps the title of CEO but the chief operating officer controls the budget, the staff, and the partnerships. The COO ends up calling most of the shots. That slow transfer of practical authority laid the groundwork for a family that would take center stage. They built influence by controlling land, loyalty, and the means of war. Military strength mattered more than pomp. A leading figure among them reorganized the army and made cavalry a decisive force, rewarding loyal warriors with grants of land so they had skin in the game. Picture a modern manager giving stock options to top performers so they stick around. Only the options were fields, villages, and the right to collect taxes. Success on the battlefield brought prestige and recruits, success at keeping supporters fed and rewarded kept the machine humming. In everyday terms, people followed leaders who paid their soldiers and kept the roads safe for merchants, and that practical competence beat royal name recognition every time. Legitimacy came next, and it arrived through an alliance with the church that was both political and symbolic. Instead of waiting for bloodlines to make authority respectable, the rising family sought and received public blessing from the Pope, turning de facto power into recognized rule. When a spiritual authority anointed a new ruler, ordinary people and local elites were more likely to accept the change. It was like getting an endorsement from a major influencer before launching a big company rebrand. The family also aided the church with protection and land, and in return the church offered moral and administrative support, scribes, educated clergy, and ceremonies that made the new order feel rightful and stable. Administration and local control were tightened to hold gains together. Regional leaders known as counts were overseen more closely, and royal envoys checked up on their performance and justice. The dynasty leaned on bishops and monasteries to run schools, keep records, and manage local affairs, because a literate clergy could handle paperwork better than a village chief. For ordinary people this meant more predictable justice, clearer tax demands, and better coordination in times of trouble, like having a regional manager show up occasionally to make sure the stores are stocked and the streets are safe. Small reforms like these, combined with military rewards and church backing, explain how a family that started as court stewards rose to dominate an entire political landscape, setting patterns that would shape European life for generations. Military genius or ruthless commander? Charlemagne pushed his realm outward through a steady series of campaigns against neighbors like the Saxons, Lombards, and Avars, while using marriage, treaties, and rewards to bind allies to his side. He organized armies that could move, camp, and fight across rough terrain, and he made the state responsible for keeping roads and bridges usable so supplies and messengers could travel. This attention to logistics, making sure the army had food, fodder, and a path to follow, is the kind of practical skill that separates a clever commander from a lucky one. Short of magic, supply lines are everything. Tactics were simple but effective: quick marches to surprise opponents, fortified bases to hold conquered ground, and the use of cavalry to hit weak points. He also absorbed skilled fighters into his forces, creating a mix of troops that adapted to different enemies. Think of it like running a company project where you borrow the best people from another team instead of hiring new ones. You get speed and expertise, but you must manage loyalty. There was diplomacy too, not just the sword. Envoys, oaths, and land grants made resistance less attractive for some. Sometimes diplomacy came with an edge. When a deal failed, force followed. At the same time his methods could be brutal. Contemporary documents report an execution of many Saxon rebels after a major uprising, an episode long debated by historians over exact numbers and motives. Forced baptisms, deportations, and severe punishments for rebels show a pattern. He used conversion and resettlement to change society quickly. That kind of policy reads cold to modern ears. If you run a neighborhood watch by banning everyone who disagrees with you, you're effective, but you'll also have angry neighbors and a bad reputation. So which label fits better, military genius or ruthless commander? Both, really. He planned and organized on a scale few of his contemporaries matched, and those organizational gifts created lasting stability in many regions. Yet the stability often came at a heavy human cost, and measures that crushed rebellion also left scars. For modern leaders the lesson is practical: clear strategy and logistics win battles, but the way you use power shapes whether people remember you as a respected planner or a feared enforcer. History rarely hands out clean verdicts, and in this case the answer sits somewhere between brilliance and brutality, with a footnote reminding us that efficiency and ethics are not the same thing. Uniting Western Europe, conquests and diplomacy. Charlemagne expanded Frankish control across much of Western Europe by blending forceful campaigns with careful negotiation, carving a political map that had not existed before. He drove armies into Lombard Italy and into the lands of the Saxons and Avars, and pushed his influence into the borderlands of Iberia, not only to win territory but to secure trade routes and protect the church. The Pope became a key partner, and their relationship turned military victories into political legitimacy when the papacy publicly supported his rule. This mixture of sword and handshake helped turn a loose patchwork of tribes and duchies into a more connected realm. On the battlefield he relied on mobile, well-led forces that could move quickly over long distances, and he recruited local levies as needed, combining central command with regional manpower. Logistics mattered. Supplying horses, food, and winter quarters was as important as winning a skirmish, and his campaigns show attention to those practical details. He both besieged fortified towns and negotiated surrenders, preferring to bind new regions into his orbit rather than destroy them wholesale. Think of it as a mix between a military campaign and a long, stubborn neighborhood negotiation. Sometimes you have to knock a few doors down, but most of the time you convince people to agree on rules for the street. To hold newly won lands he relied heavily on institutions rather than on constant garrisoning. Local counts administered counties, while royal envoys checked on them regularly to prevent abuse of power. These envoys traveled with clear instructions and reported back to the central court, much like auditors visiting branch offices today. Clergy were often appointed to civic roles because bishops could read, write, and had moral authority, skills that made them useful managers in an age when literacy was rare. The result was a layered system. Local leaders handled day-to-day issues, but they owed loyalty and law to a sovereign who sent inspectors and could replace them. Diplomacy went beyond titles and officials. Gifts, embassies, marriage ties, and negotiated marches or buffer zones helped stabilize frontiers. Relations with neighboring powers involved sending envoys, exchanging presents, and sometimes promising mutual recognition to avoid open war. On the Spanish frontier he established a zone of allied lords as a cushion. With empires to the east and rulers to the south he kept lines of communication open, combining respect and leverage. In ordinary life terms, he secured the realm not by micromanaging every village, but by creating shared incentives, like a landlord arranging a community garden and rules everyone agrees to follow. All of this was bound together by religion as a unifying language. Converting leaders and integrating churches made different peoples accept similar legal and moral norms, which is a powerful form of diplomacy. He used law codes and council decrees to harmonize practices across regions, and education efforts helped spread common administrative skills. Small humor helps here. It was less about multitasking and more about multitasking with a sword in one hand and a charter in the other. The net result was a polity that was more integrated, more stable, and more capable of projecting authority, a model of rule that influenced how Europeans organized power for generations. The Saxon Wars, Faith and Force. Charlemagne fought a long, determined campaign to bring the Saxon people under his rule and into the Christian fold, and he used both armies and the church to do it. The Saxons lived in the forests and marshes of what is now northern Germany and resisted outside rule. Their worship took place in groves and at sacred pillars, practices that clashed with the Frankish king's goal of a unified Christian realm. The conflict was not a single battle but a series of campaigns stretching over decades, with periods of brutal fighting followed by attempts at legal and religious control. The methods used combined the very physical with the administrative. Armies marched into Saxon territory, forts were built, and sacred sites like the Irminsul, a pillar venerated by many Saxons, were destroyed as symbolic blows to pagan belief. At the same time laws were issued that tried to stamp out pagan rites and force Christian practice. One such law set very severe penalties, even death, for those who persisted in certain pagan rituals or resisted baptism. Think of it like a government banning a neighborhood's traditional festival and arresting the organizers, only far harsher and backed by sword and law. One notorious episode recorded by contemporaries tells of thousands of Saxon captives executed after a revolt, an act that has been a focus of controversy ever since. Resistance was persistent and personal. Saxon leaders, most famously Widukind, organized uprisings and kept retreating to the forests when pressed. At times they negotiated and at other times they rose up again. This back and forth made the conflict feel, to those involved, like trying to teach a stubborn relative new habits. You cajole, you punish, and sometimes you resign yourself to a slow, grudging change. Eventually some leaders accepted baptism and Frankish authority, sometimes as a practical move to secure land or safety. Baptism, in this context, was both a spiritual ceremony and a political tool, a way of announcing loyalty to a new ruler and new social rules. The outcome reshaped the region in lasting ways while leaving a complicated legacy. Saxon territories were gradually integrated into the Frankish state, their elites converted, and the church planted missions and built parishes, so that over time a Christian cultural framework took root. But the process involved forced measures that modern readers find shocking, and historians still debate whether to emphasize state-building, religious zeal, or sheer coercion. In everyday terms, it's like watching a small town become part of a big city. Some customs fade, newcomers bring different rules, and people adapt, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure. Looking back, the Saxon campaigns show how religion and politics can be entangled. Missions followed the banners, and laws backed up sermons. The mix produced a Europe where church and ruler often worked hand in glove, which shaped medieval life from liturgy to law. Few of those on either side would have called it peaceful social outreach. It was messy, often brutal, and effective in the sense that it changed who ruled and who prayed. A grim lesson remains: cultural change can be achieved by persuasion, but when force is added, the results last for generations and leave stories that historians, and comedians with a dark streak, still find hard to forget. Administration, from warband to kingdom. War leadership among the Franks originally depended on personal loyalty. A leader kept a band of fighters around him, who fought for pay, plunder, or honor. Charlemagne moved away from that informal, stick-together in-battle model and built an administration where office and law mattered more than personal bonds. He created local officials, counts, who were responsible for justice, tax collection, and raising troops in their districts. Think of them as a mix between a regional mayor, a sheriff, and a recruiting officer. Counts were expected to enforce the king's rules, run courts, and supply soldiers when asked. This helped turn a loose warband culture into something resembling a functioning state, because authority stopped being only about who could shout the loudest on the battlefield. Written rules and orders became central to running the realm. Charlemagne issued laws and decisions in writing. These were collected and sent out so local officials would know what to do. Having written orders is a bit like replacing shouted instructions at a noisy construction site with clear printed checklists, fewer mistakes, and you can prove what was agreed. A central chancellery produced charters and documents, and clergy and monks, who could read and write, were often used as clerks. A learned scholar at the palace school helped improve record-keeping and teaching, so administration didn't collapse when a single official forgot the rules. In short, paperwork matters. It keeps things honest and repeatable, even if that paperwork sometimes smelled faintly of ink and vellum. Control was kept alive not just by paperwork but by regular inspection. Charlemagne sent royal envoys, commonly called missi dominici, literally, those sent by the Lord, to visit regions and check how counts were doing. These envoys usually traveled in pairs, one cleric and one layman, so they could look at both spiritual and secular affairs. They listened to complaints, reviewed local courts, and reported back to the king. It's like a modern company sending both an HR person and an operations manager to a branch office to see whether rules are followed and staff are treated fairly. The king himself didn't stay put. He traveled around the realm to hold assemblies where justice was done and policies were explained. That travel reinforced authority. When the boss shows up, people pay attention. Military organization and land management were tied to administration as well. Instead of relying entirely on a fixed warband, the system made local leaders responsible for providing soldiers, equipment, and supplies when needed. Land grants were given as rewards or to secure service, but the crown tried to keep ultimate control so these grants would serve the realm rather than create independent little kings. Bishops and monasteries played double roles, spiritual centers and administrative hubs, because they had scribes and local influence. The overall result was a blend of central rules and local execution, more predictable than pure warband chaos, but still flexible enough to work across a diverse territory. The lesson is practical and timeless. Clear delegation, regular checks, and written instructions turn reactive groups into steady organizations. And yes, even early medieval rulers discovered that a good inspector and a tidy ledger beat endless shouting on the hill. Counts, missi dominici, and bureaucracy. To hold together a realm made up of different peoples, laws, and local customs, Charlemagne relied on a chain of local officials who acted like his hands and ears across the countryside. Counts were the most important of these local rulers. Appointed by the king, a count ran a county, which meant he handled law and order, collected taxes, organized defenses and led troops when needed. Think of a count as a mix of a mayor, a judge and a militia captain rolled into one person. In practice he might be settling land disputes in the morning, collecting rents at midday, and drilling local men for defense in the afternoon. Because the job mixed public duty and private advantage, counts could gain a lot of local power, so the central government watched them closely. To keep those local powers from going off the rails, Charlemagne sent out officials known as missi dominici, literally the Lord's envoys. These were traveling inspectors who moved in pairs, usually one churchman and one lay noble, balancing spiritual authority with secular muscle. They followed set routes, stopped at towns and courts, listened to complaints, checked on how counts were running things, and made sure royal orders were actually being followed. If a count was skimming taxes or ignoring justice, the missi could record the problem and bring it back to the king. They were like royal auditors on horseback, sometimes arriving at an estate with the suddenness of a tax inspector who knows exactly where the receipts are buried. Their presence reminded local leaders that they were part of a larger system, not rulers of independent fiefdoms. Bureaucracy in this setting was not a modern civil service, but it was a clear effort to organize government by writing things down and creating permanent practices. Royal decrees, called capitularies, set rules that counts and local courts were supposed to follow. These were written and copied by clerks and monks who understood how to read and write, the practical literate backbone of administration. Records were kept of grants, legal judgments, and official appointments. In everyday terms, this was the difference between doing everything by memory and handshake and having a written receipt. A written order could be shown at a local court and had weight. When a count produced a document that said, "This land belongs to the monastery," people were more likely to accept it than if someone just argued loudly. Practical examples help show why this mattered. If a farmer had his meadow seized by a powerful neighbor, a count's court might settle the dispute, but if that count favored his friend, the farmer could appeal to the missi dominici when they rode through, who could listen, take testimony and report. Or consider military service. Counts had to raise troops from their counties. Without clear, written obligations and oversight, recruiting could become chaotic or corrupt, with exemptions sold or duties ignored. The bureaucracy tried to standardize obligations and keep the system predictable, which made it easier to plan logistics and to ensure resources were fairly, as fairly as medieval life allowed, distributed. There were limits and frictions. Counts sometimes grew into local dynasts, and missi could be resented as meddlesome outsiders. Clerks who wrote the records were often churchmen with their own priorities. Still, the combined system of appointed counts, roaming missi, and a growing habit of written administration created a degree of order across diverse lands. It made government more legible, that is, easier for a central authority to read and manage, and provided mechanisms to correct abuses. In short, the network of local officials backed by inspectors and paperwork turned scattered local power into a more coordinated polity, much like turning a bunch of separate workshops into parts of the same factory floor. A bit dry on paper, maybe, but it kept the wheels turning. Economics, land, labor and tribute. Land was the currency of power long before coin jingled in many pockets. The ruler controlled large estates that provided food, materials and authority. These royal lands were farmed directly or managed by agents and supplied the court and army. Nobles received parcels of land as rewards for service, not quite ownership in the modern sense but a right to use and profit from it while staying loyal. Think of it like being handed the keys to a big farm with the condition that you keep it running and answer to the landlord, except the landlord could also lead armies and call you to council. People who lived on those lands made the system work. Some were free smallholders who cultivated their own plots and could move if they wished, while many were tied to the soil in varying degrees and owed labor or goods to the estate. A common obligation was to work a portion of the lord's fields or to perform specific tasks, repair bridges, harvest grain, or tend animals, in return for protection and the right to cultivate a family plot. In everyday terms, a peasant might bring a basket of grain or a slab of cheese as payment, or spend a few days turning the plow on the lord's fields. It was unpaid work, and it mattered because the lord's production sustained the larger political machine. No, the peasants didn't have the luxury of a sick day policy. Tribute and taxes were often paid in kind rather than coin. Communities delivered grain, livestock, honey, or cloth to local centers. Sometimes money changed hands, but most of the economy ran on goods and services. Conquered or allied peoples also provided tribute, regular deliveries that acknowledged a ruler's authority and kept trouble at bay. Officials collected these dues, redistributed resources to the retinue and the court, or used them to supply military campaigns. To picture it simply, instead of swiping a card, people handed over the harvest or a pig when the taxman came around. This mix of land, labor, and tribute shaped everyday life and political loyalty. Granting land to a warrior meant he had a stake in the regime and a place to feed his followers, while the labor and produce of peasants kept that arrangement afloat. Markets existed, but many villages aimed for self-sufficiency. Surplus that did reach towns was often used to pay tolls, buy specialized goods, or be converted to coin at local mints. The result was a layered economy where local production met political needs, a bit like a neighborhood that grows most of its food but pools resources for a shared repairman and a watchman. What matters to us now is how these practices set patterns. Tying service to land, relying on in-kind payments, and using local officials to collect dues influenced how medieval societies organized power and resources for centuries. Modern ideas about taxes, land rights and administrative oversight echo those older habits, albeit with better paperwork. And yes, somewhere along the line someone had to keep careful track of who owed sheep and who owed labor. Bookkeeping may not be glamorous, but it kept the whole thing from collapsing, which is probably the most medieval kind of heroism there is. Revival of cities and trade. Charlemagne pushed a more reliable money system into everyday life, and that made a big difference for towns. He standardized the silver denier and set up royal mints so coins looked and weighed the same across large areas. When a baker could be paid in a coin that everyone trusted, he could buy flour from a miller in a neighboring town without endless haggling. Think of it like switching from clumsy IOUs to a smartphone payment everyone accepted, only heavier and harder to drop in the mud. Royal officers called missi dominici, who checked on local officials, also made markets safer and fairer. These envoys enforced the king's rules, capitularies, including simple things like honest scales and fair measures, so buyers stopped getting shorted by crooked merchants. Roads and bridges received attention too, which sounds boring but mattered a lot. A repaired bridge meant a cartload of wool could reach market instead of rotting by a riverbank. A wheelwright's business boomed when goods could actually get from A to B. That's the kind of practical improvement that villagers noticed first. Palaces and bishoprics turned into small economic magnets, drawing craftsmen, traders, and service providers. Aachen, for example, was not just a royal home, it was a place where artisans gathered to produce luxury objects, buildings were maintained, and local markets thrived thanks to the presence of the court. Blacksmiths, potters, and coopers found steady customers among officials and pilgrims, and towns near these centers grew more lively. Markets often aligned with religious festivals and court sessions, so you got the social side along with trade, like a medieval weekend market with better hats and worse hygiene. Long-distance trade picked up as diplomatic ties opened channels for luxury goods and useful skills. Contacts with Mediterranean realms brought silks, spices, and new ideas about craft techniques. Merchants would travel long routes, swapping regional products for exotic ones. A cloth merchant in a Frankish town might sell wool at home and buy imported dyestuffs to make his textiles fashionable elsewhere. Small-scale traders, mule drivers, and innkeepers all benefited when long-haul commerce became more regular. Overall, these practical changes, better coins, safer roads, enforced market rules, and thriving craft centers, helped revive city life and set the stage for towns to become more than just clusters of huts. They became places where people earned steady livelihoods, traded goods, and occasionally argued passionately over the price of a loaf of bread. Cultural Renaissance, the Carolingian spark. Charlemagne made the revival of learning an official goal across his domain, bringing scholars to his court and asking monasteries to copy and teach important texts. He encouraged a network of schools run by monasteries and cathedrals so that clergy and officials could actually read and write reliably. One scholar who played a big role came from the British Isles to advise on teaching methods, and his influence helped shape a clearer educational program. The result was not a sudden explosion of universities, but a steady improvement in how people read, wrote, and communicated across far-flung regions. A key practical change was the push for clearer handwriting. Scribes developed a neat, regular script that made words easier to read, in effect, a medieval effort to choose a clean font so everyone could understand official letters and church books. Think of it as standardized handwriting for the whole office. Now you could pass a document from one monastery to another without squinting. That clarity sped up copying work, reduced mistakes, and let ideas travel more smoothly, much like switching from messy handwriting to typed text makes life simpler today. Monasteries became small publishing houses of their time, where scribes copied classical literature and Christian works by hand. This was how many ancient poems and philosophical writings survived, careful copying, line, by people who saw value in older ideas. For everyday comparison, picture neighbors sharing recipes by handwriting them for each other so the cake turns out the same in every kitchen. The copying work also taught practical skills, attention to detail, patience, and organization, useful whether you were a monk or running a household. The cultural revival went beyond books into education and church life. Schools taught basic grammar, how to speak more clearly, and some arithmetic, skills needed by priests, scribes, and officials. A more consistent way of celebrating church services and making official records meant fewer local peculiarities and fewer awkward misunderstandings during travel. In short, the policy knitted people together through shared language and standards. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Standard forms and clearer texts are the small, steady things that let larger institutions function, like a dependable set of kitchen tools in a busy restaurant. The palace school and Alcuin's influence. A lively center of learning grew at the royal court, gathering scholars, students, and books under one roof to teach practical skills as well as ideas. Alcuin of York, an English scholar invited to the court, became the heart of that effort. He organized lessons, advised on what should be taught, and wrote letters and textbooks to guide teachers. He served as a tutor to royal children and as a coach for the clerks who ran the administration, so his work mixed high-minded study with everyday needs. People at court needed reliable writers, clear thinkers, and honest record keepers, and that is exactly what the school aimed to produce. The curriculum mixed language, logic, and useful arts, using a simple structure that trained the mind in stages. Grammar meant learning to read and write correctly, like teaching someone today to read a contract without being tricked. Rhetoric taught how to argue a point clearly, which helped in court debates and sermons. Arithmetic and geometry helped with land measurements and accounting, while music trained monks to sing the liturgy properly. In practice, this meant a palace child might spend the morning parsing Latin sentences and the afternoon practicing handwriting and copying a text. It sounds formal, but think of it as a medieval boot camp where the drill sergeant also insisted on neat handwriting. Alcuin pushed for clearer books and better copying practices, and his circle helped develop a neat, standardized script that made manuscripts easier to read across the realm. That clearer hand did for written Latin what a readable font does for a website today. It reduced mistakes and sped up learning. Scribes at the school and in linked monasteries copied classical authors and church texts by the dozen, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost. One can picture a scribe hunched by candlelight, carefully forming letters so that the next reader wouldn't need a decoder ring. Yes, legibility mattered even then. The practical ripple effects were large and long-lasting. Students trained at court later staffed cathedrals, monasteries, and royal chancelleries, carrying the same standards of literacy and organization into local communities. Correspondence networks, lesson plans, and copied texts moved these ideas outward like seeds on the wind. Alcuin's mix of insistence on basics and attention to detail left a legacy, a system that valued clear thinking, reliable records, and steady teaching. He could be strict, occasionally scolding slack handwriting, but his reforms turned scattered learning into something that worked for everyday government and worship, and that's no small feat. Script and scholarship, the Carolingian minuscule. A clear, rounded handwriting began to appear in monasteries and royal scriptoria as part of a deliberate effort to make books easier to read and copy. This style, now called Carolingian minuscule, used distinct, separate letter shapes and more regular spacing so words did not run together like a plate of overcooked noodles. Monks and professional scribes who learned the hand could turn messy originals into neat, uniform pages. Think of it as a medieval font makeover that saved readers from squinting for hours. Scribes trained in this hand followed simple rules: letters had consistent heights, stems were straight, and curves were gentle. Short words and long words looked different in predictable ways, so scanning a line became faster. Punctuation and a bit more regular spacing between words helped too. Reading a manuscript written in this way is closer to reading a printed book than many earlier scripts. In practical terms, it meant scholars could copy classical texts, religious works, and legal documents with fewer mistakes, which in turn made libraries more reliable repositories of knowledge. The educational impact was immediate at the places where this script was taught. Monastic schools and royal centers set up models, exemplar books that acted like handwriting templates. A novice scribe would copy those exemplars until their hand matched the model. This process is like learning to use a new keyboard layout, awkward at first, then smooth. Because of this training, text circulated with fewer corruptions, so scholars studying philosophy, medicine, or law had better sources to work from. Influence reached far beyond neat pages. Later bookmakers and early printers looked back at these clear letterforms when designing type, so modern lowercase letters owe a debt to that tidy handwriting. For anyone who's ever chosen an easy-to-read font for a presentation, the appeal is the same: clarity helps communication. And while the phrase, medieval bureaucracy, can sound grim, the clarity of this script made record-keeping and administration less error-prone, fewer missing names and less confusion about who paid which tax. It's also worth noting the human side: monasteries that adopted the hand found copying less frustrating, and readers spent less time puzzling over single letters. A humorous way to picture it is to think of a medieval librarian rolling their eyes at a tangle of abbreviations and then cheering when a fresh, legible batch of books arrived. That practical improvement in daily scholarly life helped preserve a large body of work that later scholars could study, copy, and build upon, so the script's legacy is both practical and surprisingly modern. Church and state, a symbiotic relationship. Charlemagne cultivated a close partnership with the leaders of the Western Church, trading protection and patronage for moral authority and administrative help. He defended the Pope against political enemies and in return gained a sacral endorsement that strengthened his rule across many different peoples. The crowning by Pope Leo III during a Christmas Mass in Rome gave his reign a public, religious seal that made resistance to him not just political but also spiritual. Beyond ceremonies, the relationship worked in practical ways. Monasteries and cathedral schools served as the kingdom's schools and record offices, teaching reading, copying documents, and training clergy who could also act as scribes and administrators. Alcuin of York, brought to the royal court to head the palace school, helped standardize education and liturgical practice. Think of him as a head teacher hired to overhaul the whole school district. Clergy often doubled as local officials, so a bishop could be both a preacher on Sunday and a judge or tax collector during the week. This alliance produced reforms that reached everyday people. Rules for clergy behavior, clearer liturgy, and a push for more consistent handwriting made legal documents and religious texts easier to use and spread. Practical benefits followed. A more uniform script meant fewer mistakes in copying land records, which helped settle disputes about who owned what. When a local lord tried to move a border, the written record, produced and maintained by church-trained scribes, could be decisive, like a clear receipt at a busy market. Tensions appeared too, because power shared always invites rivalry. At times the king pressured bishops to appoint officials loyal to him, and the pope's need for protection gave the monarch leverage over church affairs. Conversion policies among newly conquered peoples mixed persuasion with coercion. Missionaries and bishops worked to teach Christian practices, but military force also pressured communities to accept the new faith. That combination could be effective, but it could also breed resistance and resentment. The symbiosis fed cultural renewal as well as political control. Standardized worship and copied books helped preserve knowledge and spread ideas across regions that spoke different languages. Monasteries became places where manuscripts were illuminated and classical learning was kept alive, a bit like community libraries that could also issue permits. The church's reach into daily life, marriage, baptism, funerals, gave the state a network to communicate and enforce policies, while the state's armies gave the church security and resources to build and serve communities. In short, the partnership was a two-way street. Secular rulers got legitimacy and administrative help, the church gained protection, funding, and influence. It wasn't all harmony, there were pragmatic bargains, awkward compromises, and occasional clashes, but together they built institutions that tied scattered peoples into more orderly communities. Humorously put, it was like two neighbors sharing a fence and a tool shed. Sometimes they argued over the hammer, but most days they benefited from having each other nearby. Coronation as emperor, ritual and politics. Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head during Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, declaring him Emperor of the Romans, and the crowd in the church broke into loud acclamation. That dramatic moment mixed sacred ritual and public theater. It happened in the middle of a Christian service, so prayers, incense, and the Latin liturgy framed what was at once a religious blessing and a political act. Short and simple, a church service turned into a public promotion ceremony. Some contemporaries later reported that Charlemagne seemed taken aback, others said he accepted readily, and historians still debate just how surprised he was. The ritual itself mattered because ritual teaches people what a power change should look like. A crown is not only metal, it is a visible sign that people can point to and say, that person now stands for the office. There was no modern press release, so the Pope's act, placing the crown, speaking the words, and prompting the crowd's cheers, served as mass media. Think of it like being handed a diploma on stage while judges and all your neighbors clap. Your authority suddenly carries the weight of public confirmation and religious blessing. The sacred language used by the Pope suggested that the office had divine sanction, which in everyday terms is like getting a recommendation from the most respected person in town. The political side of the event ran deeper than theater. For the Pope, crowning a strong Western ruler signaled that the Church could call on secular power and that the Pope had a role in legitimizing rulers. For Charlemagne, the imperial title strengthened his claim to rule beyond tribal kingship and gave him a symbolic connection to the old Roman world, which mattered for how other leaders and people saw him. There was also a diplomatic sting. The Byzantines already claimed imperial continuity from ancient Rome, and a Western emperor put Rome's political map into question. In plain terms, it was a power move dressed up as a blessing, useful to both men for different reasons. The consequences echoed through everyday politics of the time. Local lords and bishops could now point to the emperor's coronation when arguing over taxes, land rights, or legal authority. The crown became a bargaining chip in negotiations, much like a company logo that suddenly means a brand, a standard, and a promise of protection. Ritual gave way to rules, ceremonial recognition made it easier to ask for obedience and enlist support for reforms. And a bit of irony, what began as a religious ceremony intended to underscore spiritual authority ended up reshaping secular government and international relations, proving that sometimes the best political moves come wrapped in incense and a choir. Relations with Byzantium and Islam. Contacts between the Frankish court and the Eastern Roman capital mixed competition with conversation, and sometimes looked like two proud neighbors arguing over who owns the street lamp. The Eastern Empire insisted it alone was the true heir of Rome, while the Western ruler wanted equal standing. That created tension. Ambassadors traveled back and forth carrying letters, complaints, and extravagant gifts, and there were even talk of marriage as a way to smooth things over, a medieval equivalent of signing a prenup to settle a business dispute. These exchanges mattered because recognition from the Eastern court could either calm a diplomatic storm or add fuel to it. Meanwhile, the Western court also kept a wary but practical eye on the Muslim states to the south and west. Military push and pull along the borderlands led to fortified buffer regions and the taking of key towns to secure trade routes, like putting up a reliable fence between fields. At the same time, diplomacy and trade were active. Envoys and merchants brought news, luxury fabrics, and spices from Muslim lands, and rulers sometimes swapped favors or non-aggression pacts with the emir in Iberia to avoid fighting on two fronts. A famous gift from the Eastern Islamic world, an elephant, arrived at the Western court, creating the kind of spectacle that made people talk for years. Imagine a modern mayor receiving a live exotic animal as a peace offering. It's funny, but it helped build respect and attention. Art and religion became another channel of contact. Court artists copied styles from the East, goldsmiths learned new techniques, and manuscripts showed influences from Byzantine models. At the same time, disagreements about church practice and imagery caused friction. The two sides did not always sing from the same hymn sheet. Those theological debates were like two families arguing over how to celebrate holidays, both sincere, but stubborn. Still, monks and clerics who traveled carried books and ideas, so monasteries and schools benefited. That movement of knowledge looked a lot like swapping recipes and stories at a community potluck. In practical terms, the mixed approach of diplomacy, military action, and cultural borrowing created a more connected Western realm. Secure frontiers reduced raiding, while trade and embassies brought goods and new techniques to local craftsmen. Think of it as opening a market stall that draws customers from far away. You gain wealth, gossip, and sometimes exotic livestock. And when things went wrong, envoys and gifts could diffuse conflict before armies marched. Charm sometimes worked better than the sword. The result was a tangled, occasionally humorous, and always important set of relationships that shaped politics, culture, and daily life across borders. Law and legal reforms. Charlemagne used royal edicts called capitularies to shape how justice worked across his lands. These were written instructions divided into short, clear chapters and sent out to local officials, much like a manager sending memos to branch offices. The idea was simple: put rules on paper so everyone knew what was expected, and rely on written orders instead of rumors. Local priests and clerks were asked to copy and keep these documents, because a law that isn't written down is as useful as a map drawn on fog. To make sure those memos actually mattered, he relied on missi dominici, royal envoys who traveled the kingdom checking on local officials. Think of them as inspectors or auditors who would drop in unannounced, listen to complaints, and report back. Their presence made it harder for dishonest counts to ignore the rules. They presided over courts during their visits and could demand evidence and witness testimony. In practice, this meant people had a clearer place to bring disputes, and it gradually pushed justice away from private revenge toward public procedure. Courts were pushed to be public affairs and not family business. Instead of settling every quarrel with a fight, communities were encouraged to use compensation, sworn testimony, and collective oaths, methods that sound formal but were practical. For example, when someone was injured, the solution could be compensation paid to the victim's family, similar to paying for damage today, rather than a vendetta. Oath helpers, people who swore on a person's character, worked like modern-day character witnesses. They could tip a case without swords coming out. He tried to balance old Germanic customs with the order of Roman practice, not by erasing local ways but by giving them a clearer framework. Local customary law stayed important, but the central push for written rules and accountable judges made outcomes more predictable. Church courts were protected and often handled clergy or spiritual issues, and the crown kept a hand on property disputes involving monasteries and churches to prevent seizures. That often meant monasteries could store legal records and act as centers of literacy, so a peasant could sometimes find a written agreement where none existed before. The long-term effect was a stronger habit of written law and centralized oversight, which later rulers could build on. Rules on paper, inspectors who enforced them, and court procedures that favored public resolution over blood feuds made everyday life a bit calmer. It didn't stop petty arguments or the occasional loud neighbor, but it did make justice less random and more enforceable, sort of like replacing neighborhood gossip with a set of house rules and a stern but fair referee. Art and architecture, palaces and chapels. Aachen's palace complex functioned as both a practical residence and a powerful statement. The heart of it was a chapel built with an unusual 8-sided plan and a dome, a shape that people at the time associated with important Roman and Byzantine buildings. An architect working at the court adapted old ideas to new needs. Columns and polished stone from older Roman sites were brought in and reused, so visitors felt a direct line to the classical past when they walked inside. This reuse, taking pieces from earlier monuments and setting them into a new building, gave the chapel a sense of age and authority without having to invent it, like hanging your grandfather's watch on a new suit to make it look respectable. Inside the chapel the light, mosaics, and marble were arranged to focus attention on the ritual and the ruler. A raised gallery overlooks the central space, and a carved throne sits in a place that lets the ruler be both seen and connected to worship below. The effect is ceremonial, almost theatrical. The idea of a westwork, a large, decorated entrance block on the building's west side with towers and rooms over the doorway, also took shape in this setting and became a model for many later churches. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a grand foyer and reception hall combined, where important guests were greeted and serious business took place, but with more incense and fewer coffee machines. Decoration mixed old and new in surprisingly modern-sounding ways. Mosaics that catch the light, patterned stone floors, carved capitals with plant and animal motifs, these were all chosen to signal learning and devotion at once. Craftspeople from different regions were invited to work at the court, bringing varied skills and styles that were blended into a coherent whole. The result looked polished and intentional, like a carefully arranged home where each chair and picture has a purpose. Liturgical objects and reliquaries were displayed with care, because the chapel's role was as much about showing sacred treasures as it was about private prayer. The design of the palace and chapel set a template that echoed across the medieval world. Later builders borrowed the idea of combining a ruler's residence with an imposing, ceremonial church nearby. They copied the westwork, the clear geometry, and the way light was used to frame important moments. In practical terms, this meant that a ruler could run government business, host foreign envoys, and perform religious rites without leaving his compound, efficient, if you were a busy monarch. And for modern visitors and architects, those simple, sturdy lines and the mix of old and new still feel familiar. The buildings read like a carefully edited resume of authority and faith, with just a pinch of royal flair, no royal Wi-Fi required. Daily life at Charlemagne's court. Within the Great Hall at Aachen the daily rhythm mixed prayer, paperwork, and hospitality in ways that kept a large household busy from dawn to dusk. Mornings often began with liturgy in the palace chapel, where clerics and the ruler attended Mass. Worship was not just a private act but a public, organizing force that set the tone for the day. After prayers, councils met, advisors, bishops, and nobles gathered around the ruler to bring local complaints, review governance, or discuss military matters. These gatherings were practical affairs. A noble might come to present a dispute over land, while a bishop explained how a monastery was coping, clear, direct, often brisk. The palace was also a school and a workshop. Scholars such as Alcuin of York taught grammar, scripture, and the art of writing to young nobles and clerics, because clear reading and careful copying meant better laws, better prayers, and fewer lost messages. Scribes worked in a scriptorium copying manuscripts by hand. They used a clear script later called Carolingian minuscule, which made reading easier much like a neat print font does today. For example, a monk copying a gospel would sit under a window for light, ink on his fingers, and patience as his main tools. This emphasis on learning had everyday effects. Officials kept better records and letters traveled more reliably between regions. Household life was crowded and busy, with many roles you might recognize in a modern institution. There were cooks and bakers turning out large loaves, stewards who managed supplies, stable hands caring for horses, and cupbearers who served drinks. Food on the table varied. Bread and pottage were staples, while meat, fish, cheese, and fruit rounded out meals for the wealthier. Wine and spiced dishes showed status when available. A humorous but practical detail: salt and spices were treated like luxury extras, so hosts used them sparingly, a bit like saving the fancy ketchup for guests who really deserved it. Entertainments and leisure had an important place too. Hunting was both sport and demonstration of leadership. A successful hunt showed skill and provided fresh meat for feasts. Musicians, jongleur, and storytellers performed in halls to keep guests amused, and a person trained in music might teach a noble child as part of their upbringing. Storytelling had a double duty: it was entertainment, and also a way to pass on laws, history, and expectations in memorable form. Short plays or recited poems broke the monotony of long council days, and laughter was a currency everyone spent freely when the mood allowed. Administration continued behind the scenes, and the court's reach extended into daily governance. Officials known as missi dominici, essentially royal envoys or inspectors, traveled the realm to check that local leaders followed the ruler's commands and to report back. That system kept central authority connected to distant areas. When disputes were brought before the ruler, the court acted as a high court of appeal. Common people could, at least in principle, seek justice there. Everyday decisions about land, taxes, and law were shaped in those judgments, so the court's daily business affected ordinary lives far from the palace. Clothing and appearance signaled rank plainly. Nobles wore finer fabrics like dyed wool, linen, and occasionally imported silk, while servants and laborers used simpler garments. Jewelry, belts, and brooches helped identify status, much like a uniform or a badge might today. Travel was a regular feature as well. The royal household moved often so the ruler could visit different regions, meet local leaders, and display presence. That meant packing up tents, supplies, and layers of servants, a logistical challenge that required organization and a sense of humor about dust on one's shoes. Daily life at the court, then, was an intertwining of ceremony and work, learning and governance, celebration and inspection. It might be grand in appearance, but underneath the finery were practical routines: prayers that structured the day, scribes making sense of records, cooks feeding many mouths, and envoys carrying authority across distances. Little moments of human detail: a monk wiping ink from his fingers, a noble arguing over a boundary, a musician getting the tune wrong and being forgiven with a laugh, made the court feel like a bustling community rather than a distant throne. Women, family and dynastic strategy. Charlemagne treated his family like the backbone of his rule, not just a private matter. He formed marriages and relationships that connected him to powerful neighbors and internal nobles, and he had both legitimate wives and other partners who bore him children. Among his household were well-known figures: a wife from a Lombard royal line who linked him to the Italian kingdom for a time, a noblewoman from the eastern regions whose children included his eventual heir, and later wives who helped secure support on different frontiers. He also had daughters who featured in diplomatic plans and sons given places of authority around the empire. Marriages were often less about romance and more like strategic handshakes. Giving a daughter in marriage could seal a peace treaty or bind a rival family. Taking a wife from a prominent local clan could turn potential troublemakers into relatives. A famous case involved negotiations with the Byzantine court over a proposed match for one of his daughters, a sign that he played royal matchmaking on a continental scale. When plans succeeded, they brought stability. When they failed, they left awkward family dinners and diplomatic headaches. Women in Charlemagne's circle did more than look after the household. Wives and noblewomen ran large estates, managed finances when the ruler was away, and sponsored monasteries and schools, which in turn spread the ruler's influence through religion and learning. One queen traveled with him on campaigns and supervised the upbringing of future leaders, while daughters sometimes entered convents for genuine religious reasons and sometimes because placing a child in the church was a tidy political move to reduce rivalry for inheritance. Think of it like modern companies placing family members into different branches so no one fights over the main office, only with more veils and fewer HR memos. His strategy combined marriage alliances, putting sons into key regional positions, and using religious life as a tool to shape succession. He tried to name reliable heirs by elevating certain sons to important roles, but the older custom of dividing lands among male heirs made perfect unity hard to achieve. Still, by marrying into local power networks, using daughters as diplomatic links, and placing trusted children and relatives in charge of border regions, he created a web of loyalty that held a very diverse realm together for a long time. It was practical, often messy, and sometimes almost comically human, family politics plus statecraft, like a soap opera where the prize was the throne. Religion, conversion and missionary work. Charlemagne saw Christianity as more than a private belief, he treated it as a tool to hold his many peoples together under one roof. He worked closely with church leaders, putting bishops and abbots into places of power where they could teach, settle disputes, and help run the region, in effect making priests part of the local civil service. Alcuin of York and other scholars at his court helped train clergy so sermons made sense and church books were correct, because confusing prayers do not make good converts. This was practical statecraft. A shared faith created shared rules, common calendars, and a vocabulary everyone could use. Missionary work under his rule mixed gentle teaching with practical help. Monks and missionaries set up monasteries that doubled as schools, farms, and hospitals, offering literacy, farming know-how, and basic care alongside religious instruction. Think of a monastery as a small community center where children learned to read, farmers learned better crop techniques, and the local sick got tended to, all while monks chanted prayers. Some missionaries learned local languages, married local customs to Christian stories, and slowly persuaded people. Others simply offered immediate improvements in daily life, which made the new religion attractive. But conversion was not always optional, and that tension mattered a lot. In places where open resistance was strong, military campaigns and harsh legal penalties were used to stop old rituals and encourage baptism, so some people accepted Christianity out of fear or convenience rather than belief. That mixture produced unstable results, occasional rebellions and simmering resentment alongside genuine new communities of faith. In plain terms, forcing someone to wear a new hat does not mean they like the hat. It can, however, make them wear it every Sunday. At the same time, Charlemagne pushed for reform inside the church itself. He encouraged clearer liturgy and better educated priests so that worship would be uniform and understandable across his lands. The palace school and networks of monasteries became training centers, producing clergy who could read, write, and administer. This effort at quality control reduced mistakes in church books and made sermons and sacraments more consistent, a bit like updating a company manual so every office follows the same process. The practical takeaways still matter today. Combining education and social services with religious outreach can build long-term relationships. Coercion breeds short-term compliance and long-term instability. Modern organizations working across cultures can learn from both the successes and the failures, help people with real needs, respect local customs when possible, and avoid heavy-handed pressure. And yes, using a church network to run schools and clinics might sound like ancient management consulting, but it worked, just maybe not the way a modern NGO would prefer. Education, literacy, and knowledge networks. Charlemagne pushed a clear policy to bring learning back into daily life across his realms, not as an abstract hobby for elites but as a practical tool for government and the church. He gathered scholars at his court, most famously Alcuin of York, who helped run the palace school and advise on teaching methods. This was a place where princes and clerics received formal instruction, a bit like a royal academy or a focus training program. The court became a magnet for teachers, copyists, and students, creating a hub where ideas and books flowed toward the regions under his authority. Monasteries and cathedrals were turned into active schools rather than quiet retreats, because clergy needed to read, pray, and administer reliably. Royal decrees instructed bishops and abbots to open schools attached to their institutions so local priests and future teachers could learn basic reading, writing, and religious texts. To make sure this actually happened, Charlemagne sent out trusted officials, the missi dominici, essentially royal inspectors, to check that teachers were appointed and that standards were met. Think of it as an early version of education inspectors visiting small towns to ensure a school actually teaches spelling and arithmetic. A major practical innovation was the effort to standardize handwriting and text so information could travel without getting garbled. Scribes in monastery scriptoria copied books carefully, and a new, clear script, now called Carolingian minuscule, was promoted because it made manuscripts easier to read and reproduce accurately. In plain terms, they switched from messy handwriting that looked like a squirrel's nest to something like neat block letters, which meant fewer mistakes in copied laws, prayers, and letters. Monks bent over quills were the copyists. Picture them as earnest office workers, but with more incense and fewer coffee breaks. These local schools, the court scholarly circle, and the network of monasteries formed a living network for knowledge. Books, ideas, teachers, and students moved around the realm and beyond. Correspondence between the court and scholars in distant places brought in new texts and learning methods, and libraries at important centers collected and lent works, acting like early lending libraries. The practical payoff showed up in clearer administration, more uniform church services, and a better trained clergy who could keep records and manage communities. In short, the effort to teach, copy, and connect laid groundwork that later medieval learning built upon, and it also spared later historians the headache of deciphering hopelessly bad handwriting. Science, astronomy, and timekeeping. Charlemagne invited learned men to his court and pushed for better teaching of how the sky works and how to reckon time. Scholars from different places taught basic arithmetic and the study of the heavens so that monks and clerics could keep accurate calendars and run the liturgy on schedule. Alcuin of York was one of the leading teachers brought into this circle, helping set up schools where simple astronomy, like following the sun and moon to mark days and months, became part of the curriculum. The result was not secret stargazing for fun, it was practical training so churches could ring bells at the right times and communities could agree when feasts should fall. A big, practical problem at the time was figuring when Easter should be celebrated, and that demanded a workable method for combining the moon's phases with the sun's year. Monks used what they called computus, rules and tables that translate lunar cycles into calendar dates, so the whole church observed the same festival together. Think of it like planning a yearly family reunion that depends on both the date and the phase of the moon. Without shared rules, someone shows up for cake when everyone else is already in church. Writings that explained these calculations, both older works and newly copied texts, circulated through monasteries and cathedral schools so the method didn't get lost in translation. Practical astronomy also meant teaching with hands-on examples rather than abstract theory. Monastic schools copied and preserved works on numbers and the heavens so students could learn from clear texts, and a cleaner handwriting style made those books easier to read, much like switching from a cramped grocery list to a typed recipe. Sundials and simple water clocks were common tools in cloister gardens and chapter houses. They helped mark the canonical hours when monks rose, prayed, and ate. A sundial on a wall is nothing glamorous, but it told a monk whether it was time for terce or for none, and it beat arguing about whether the sun looked like noon that day. The impact reached everyday life beyond the cloister. Accurate time reckoning meant markets and courts could be scheduled with fewer disputes, and farmers could follow seasonal cues. People paid attention to moon phases for certain planting tasks, and to daylight length for timing harvesting. Bells and fixed prayer times acted like communal alarms in a world without wristwatches, and that regularity kept towns, monasteries, and the royal household running smoothly. In short, the emphasis on learning about the sky and on practical methods for measuring time turned abstract knowledge into usable skills that shaped religious life, work routines, and local administration across the realm. No snooze button required. The role of monasteries in preservation. Monasteries acted as the main hubs for saving books and knowledge during Charlemagne's time, where monks spent long hours copying texts by hand so ideas could survive and travel. People like Alcuin of York advised rulers and monasteries on teaching and book preservation, and that advice helped create libraries and schools attached to many communities. These were not quiet, dusty closets of one kind of book. They held religious writings, the works of classical Latin authors, and practical manuals that people actually used. In practice, a room called a scriptorium was where scribes copied texts. A scriptorium is basically an old-fashioned copy room, rows of long tables, candles or windows, quill pens, and ink. Monks copied slowly and carefully, often adding little decorations or illustrations at the margins. Think of it as handmade photocopying with better handwriting, and yes, some monks developed handwriting that made modern doctors look careless. To make things clearer across distant places, a simpler, more readable script was developed, so a text copied in one monastery could be read easily in another. Beyond copying, monasteries organized and cared for collections of books, proto-libraries. They kept records, legal documents, and letters, which meant local memory was stored safely under lock and key, often literally in chests or chained to shelves. This was practical stuff. Farming tips, medical recipes, and liturgical music were preserved alongside theological and philosophical writings. A farmer's son could learn better planting techniques from a monastic manual just as much as a clerk could learn how to keep account books. Monastic schools taught reading and writing to monks and to some lay students, producing trained scribes and administrators who could run estates and local courts. In effect, monasteries trained the people who kept government and church functions working. These trained hands and minds helped ensure that documents were copied accurately and that important decisions and laws were recorded, not lost when leaders moved on. The result was a chain of preservation that stretched across regions. Books copied in one house would be passed to another, shared with courts, or loaned out for study. Without such networks, many classical texts and local records might have vanished. In modern terms, monasteries were part library, part archive, part university, and part backup drive, all rolled into one quiet, candlelit institution. And while monks probably didn't expect praise for their handwriting, their careful work left a legacy that scholars still build on today. Legacy, the idea of a European empire. Charlemagne's rule reshaped how people thought about political unity in Western Europe. He helped turn a loose collection of tribes and small kingdoms into the idea of a single political and cultural community under one higher authority. That idea was less a drawn map and more a picture in people's heads, one ruler, backed by the church, who could claim a kind of leadership over wide lands and many peoples. Practical steps made the idea stick. He appointed local officials called counts to manage regions and sent royal inspectors, missi dominici, to check on them, making sure orders were followed. Think of it like a CEO who can't be in every branch, so he sends trusted managers to audit operations and report back. He also supported schooling at the court and encouraged clearer handwriting so books could be copied and read across distances. This was like standardizing a font so everyone's notes were legible. Those moves created administrative habits and cultural ties that outlived any single ruler. The idea carried strong symbolic weight too. The relationship between a powerful ruler and the church created a model in which political authority and religious sanction reinforced each other. Later kings and popes often pointed to that model when they wanted to claim bigger authority or to justify coronations and titles. Rituals, ceremonies, and the image of a universal Christian ruler became tools for later leaders who wanted to present themselves as part of a long, respectable tradition. That symbolic power survived into modern times and still turns up in political language and ceremonies. A prize named after him rewards people who work for European unity, and various politicians have evoked his memory when discussing cooperation across borders. The practical echoes are easy to spot in today's shared legal practices, educational exchanges, and cross-border institutions. It's the old idea dressed in modern clothes. You could compare it to neighbors setting up a community garden. Everyone keeps their own house, but they agree on rules and share tools so the whole block benefits. In the end, his legacy is not just a map of conquests. It's a durable concept, a template for combining authority, law, culture, and religion to make a wide and diverse area feel like something more than a patchwork. That mix of administration, learning, and symbolism kept being useful for centuries. It's the sort of historical brand that leaders and thinkers keep reaching for when they want to talk about unity, and sometimes to get their mail delivered more reliably. Mythmaking after death, legends and lore. After his death, ordinary memory and organized storytelling braided together until the real man and the made-up hero were hard to tell apart. Poets and minstrels turned military campaigns and court decisions into sweeping adventures, giving listeners larger moral meanings and simple heroes to root for. One clear example is the Song of Roland, a very influential epic that turned a frontier clash into a tale of bravery, betrayal, and a lone knight blowing a horn so loud it became the stuff of legend. The term used for those kinds of poems, chansons de geste, literally means songs of deeds. Think of them as medieval superhero origin stories sung over and over at market squares and hearths. Relics and tombs also played a big role in building the legend. The place where he was buried became a stop for pilgrims and a focal point for miracle stories, which made the ruler seem not only powerful in life but still influential after death. Churches and local leaders treated bones and personal items like evidence of sacred status, and people traveled to see them much like tourists visit celebrity graves today. That practice gave people hope. Small, everyday miracles were reported and retold, and helped political leaders claim a direct line to a glorious past. In simple terms, relics worked like reputation insurance, paid out in stories and loyalty. Folklore layered on top of official memory with vivid characters and recurring motifs. The paladins, the elite knights in his service, became archetypal champions in countless stories, each with signature weapons and dramatic last stands. Roland's horn and a famous sword, often named Durendal, show up again and again, symbols that made abstract ideas such as honor and sacrifice easy to picture. These items are like the props of a long-running television show. People knew what to expect when the horn was mentioned, and their imaginations filled in the rest. Those repeated images taught values as well: loyalty, courage, and the willingness to face overwhelming odds for the common good. A broader pattern in European folklore also transformed him into a sleeping savior in some local tales, a king in the mountain figure who will return in a time of need. That sense of deferred arrival comforts communities during hard times, kind of like the way families joke that a retired relative will show up when the barbecue is finally worth attending. This motif linked him to other legendary rulers, and helped regional traditions keep his memory alive through festivals, plays, and pageants. Even today, parades and reenactments, especially around places associated with his life, borrow heavily from those stories, blending historical fact with theatrical embellishment. Writers and political leaders in later centuries recycled and reshaped these legends to suit new goals. Chronicles, romances, and official ceremonies selectively highlighted deeds that fit current ideas about kingship and piety. The result was a flexible legend that could be dressed up as a model Christian monarch, a proto-European unifier, or a martial exemplar depending on who was telling the tale. In practical terms, that meant his image became a tool, useful for rallying support, promoting moral education, or creating a sense of shared identity. Think of it as historical branding, with songs, shrines, and stories as the marketing team. The Treaty of Verdun and the fragmentation. After Charlemagne's death, his huge realm could not stay whole under a single ruler, and his grandsons finally agreed to split the land by a formal settlement in 843. The agreement gave three distinct parts to the three claimants. One got the western provinces that roughly became the core of France, another received the eastern lands that later became Germany, and the middle strip, a long, narrow zone from the North Sea down toward Italy, stayed under the third brother, who kept the imperial title. That central piece, often called by a name derived from its ruler Lothair, was awkwardly shaped and hard to govern. Think of it like cutting a cake into three slices where one slice is a long ribbon winding through the whole plate. It looks fair only on paper. The immediate effect was loss of strong, unified rule. Local counts and dukes, who had been under the emperor's eye, found room to act more independently. Power drifted downward. Peasants and towns then dealt with nearby lords rather than one distant court. An everyday comparison helps. When you break up a big company into smaller regional offices and the headquarters loses control, regional managers start making their own rules. And that is exactly what happened, except the managers were armored, and their offices were castles. The Middle Kingdom proved especially unstable. It was a corridor that many wanted because it linked north to south and contained important roads and cities, but its odd shape made defense and administration difficult. Borderlines shifted often, and neighboring rulers kept picking away at it. Meanwhile, external raiders and opportunists noticed the split and took advantage of it. Divided defense is weak defense. Picture several neighbors each guarding their own yard while the alley between them goes unattended. It doesn't take long for trouble to walk through. Long term, the settlement etched new patterns of language, law, and identity into Western Europe. It didn't create modern states overnight, yet it set the map on a course where distinct Western and Eastern political centers matured over centuries. Local loyalties grew stronger than loyalty to a distant emperor, and that helped shape medieval life: local courts, local taxes, local wars. You could say the treaty sowed the seeds for both medieval fragmentation and the later idea of nationhood, though those flowers took a very long time to bloom. Long-term impact on medieval institutions. Charlemagne's push to bring order to a patchwork of local powers left a clear blueprint for how medieval institutions ran after him. He strengthened the role of local officials and created regular inspections that kept those officials in check. Think of those inspectors as early auditors who rode from town to town making sure taxes were collected and justice was done, like a regional manager checking branches, but traveling on horseback. This pattern made government less about personal favor and more about lasting office, so later rulers could copy the same setup without reinventing everything each time. Church life also felt the effects, in ways ordinary people would notice at once. Bishops and abbots were asked to run schools, teach priests, and keep records, so churches became centers of learning and record-keeping. For a parishioner, that meant a priest who could read and write better and keep clearer records of births, deals, and land ownership. The tighter bond between ruler and church made both sides more organized. In practice, the ruler got educated administrators, and the church got legal protection. Sometimes it looked like a church office meeting where one side brought theology and the other side brought a ledger. A surprising practical change was in handwriting and books. Scribes were encouraged to use a clear script that made documents easier to read across regions. That small change mattered a lot. Documents were copied more accurately and laws could be read by people far from the original place. It's a bit like switching from messy handwriting to a clean font on a shared website so everyone can understand the rules. Monasteries became the copying centers, preserving old works and teaching new readers, and that steady training of minds fed into the rise of cathedral schools and, later on, universities. Administrative and legal practices became steadier and more predictable because of the reforms. Rules for courts, tax lists, and land records were written down more often than before, which made disputes easier to settle. For everyday folks, that meant landlords and villagers had a firmer sense of who owned what and why. The long-term payoff showed up in how later medieval kings and nobles claimed authority. They borrowed the idea that rule could be expressed through written law and regular offices, not just personal strength. And yes, this also left a fair amount of paperwork for successors to sort through, paperwork that helped make the medieval world more organized and, in many ways, more like the institutions we recognize today. Historiography: how scholars see Charlemagne. Einhard's biography is still the single most famous early account of the man, and manuscripts, royal decrees, monastery records, and even coins and building remains fill in the rest of the picture. These are the kinds of things historians rely on when they try to understand what Charlemagne actually did and what people later made of him. Some of the written sources were produced by people at his court who wanted to praise him, so scholars treat them carefully, like reading a glowing Facebook post and knowing it might be a bit edited. Early modern and 19th century scholars often turned him into a symbol, someone to stand for national pride or cultural continuity. Think of it like two rival sports teams both claiming the same all-time superstar. Different writers picked and chose episodes that fit their story: an image of a Christian protector, a restorer of Roman order, or a founder of nations. That selective storytelling needs to be weighed against what local records and physical evidence actually show. During the 20th century, many historians pushed back against those big, clean narratives and looked at the messy day-to-day mechanics of rule instead. They asked concrete questions: how did he communicate with local officials, how were laws enforced, and what did those decrees actually change for farmers and monks? Terms like capitulary, a set of royal rules, and missi dominici, royal agents sent to inspect regions, sound fancy, but you can think of them as memos and auditors, ways a ruler tried to keep track of his realm. Scholars debate whether these tools created a strong centralized state or a looser network of personal ties. The answer often depends on the region or the source you trust. More recent work mixes old and new approaches. Literary critics, archaeologists, and manuscript experts all weigh in, and digital projects let researchers compare more documents than ever. People like Rosamund McKitterick have shown how books and script-making mattered to power, while others emphasize ritual, symbolism, and local elites. There's also growing interest in voices on the margins, women in court circles, rural communities, and monastic networks, because understanding power means looking beyond the throne. Historians still argue about the big labels, but they increasingly agree that the real story is complicated, shaped both by the man himself and by generations who turned him into a convenient idea. And yes, historians can be as opinionated as your relatives at a reunion. The debates continue, and that's part of why the subject stays lively. Popular culture, from opera to video games. Charlemagne appears again and again in art and entertainment, not just as a dry textbook figure but as a dramatic hero, a villain, a legend, and sometimes a cheeky Easter egg. Medieval epic poems known as chansons de geste, simple, action-packed storytelling sung or recited by minstrels, made him the leader of a band of almost superheroes. Think of those poems as the medieval equivalent of comic books that celebrated brave knights. One famous poem from that cycle centers on Roland, one of his closest knights, and that story has fed operas, plays, and paintings for centuries. In everyday terms, the same stories that once inspired troubadours now inspire stage directors and illustrators who like a good clash of swords and clear heroes. Baroque and classical musicians put those grand tales on stage, and opera houses loved the mix of battle, faith, and gallantry. Jean-Baptiste Lully's opera about Roland, for example, turns the chanson tradition into a sung drama with choruses and big, dramatic gestures. Opera makes use of spectacle. The chorus becomes the crowd, the orchestra does the mood setting, and the lead singers act like the film stars of their day. Today's productions add modern lighting and projection, so a scene of a cavalry charge can look more like a blockbuster movie than an old play. That contrast often leads to fun moments, a soprano belting a high note while a pretend horse does a slow-motion trot. It's theatrical, sometimes earnest, sometimes campy, and always a way for people to meet the legend in an emotionally powerful package. Beyond opera, the legend shows up in comics, children's books, and historical novels where authors simplify complicated politics into clear storylines kids and adults can follow. Picture a picture book that turns the paladins into cartoon heroes who share snacks and save villages. That's how younger readers get introduced. Graphic novels often highlight the drama, betrayal, loyalty, and myth-making, using vivid art instead of long paragraphs. Museums and local festivals keep the stories alive in a hands-on way, medieval fairs with costumed reenactors, sword demonstrations, and school group tours to cathedrals and old royal sites. A classroom visit where students try on replica chainmail or hear a reenactor explain a knight's shield can make the past feel as immediate as a school field trip to a science center. Video games have taken the legend into interactive territory, where players can rewrite or replay the rise of great rulers. Grand strategy titles often let you manage kingdoms, negotiate with nobles, and build institutions, so Charlemagne's image is useful as the template of a ruler who unites territories and builds a court. Some games treat him as a playable ruler, others as an ancestral figure whose legacy shapes a dynasty's claims. Role-playing games and mods sometimes rework the myths into quests. You might be sent on a holy errand by a ruler who is clearly modeled on him, or face mythic enemies drawn from the same stories. This turns classroom facts into decisions. Should you centralize power or appease local rulers? Those choices feel a lot like modern management problems, only with more chainmail. Fans also create mods that expand scenarios, adding historically flavored units or missions, which keeps the material fresh and community-driven. That lasting presence matters because Charlemagne functions symbolically in very modern ways. He's used as shorthand for unity, law, cultural revival, or imperial ambition, depending on who's telling the story. Art and entertainment pick out whichever trait they need: magnanimous unifier for a heroic opera, complex ancestor for a strategy game, or a mythic figure for a comic book. In everyday life people encounter him through place names, statues, tourist sites, and school stories. In pop culture they find reinterpretations that make him a funny, terrifying, or inspiring figure. And sometimes he's simply a great plot device: big ego, bigger cavalry, and plenty of loyal followers, so storytellers, game designers, and performers will likely keep borrowing him for as long as audiences like a good campaign and a good song. Debates and controversies, dark sides revisited. Charlemagne's reputation as a unifier often sits next to darker reports of violent suppression and forced cultural change, and scholars still argue about how to read those reports. Contemporary chronicles such as the Royal Frankish Annals and the writings of Einhard record campaigns, mass baptisms, and harsh punishments, but they come from a particular point of view, the victor's point of view, and that makes interpretation tricky. One famous episode is described in the sources as a brutal crackdown on resisting communities. Some historians accept the descriptions at face value, while others urge caution, suggesting errors in transmission, propaganda motives, or later exaggeration. Religious policy is a central point of contention. Converting pagan populations was not just spiritual work, it was also political control. Reports of mass baptisms and the destruction of sacred sites show a pattern where accepting the new faith meant accepting new laws and new rulers. Think of it like a town being told it must adopt a new official language and set of rules overnight. Daily routines change, local leaders lose footing, and resentment builds. Critics say such policies amounted to coercion rather than true religious change, while defenders argue that rulers of the period used conversion as a common tool to stabilize diverse territories. Administrative reforms bring their own controversies. Royal decrees called capitularies set uniform rules across distant lands, and royal envoys, missi dominici, checked that those rules were followed. In practice this tightened central power and reduced local autonomy. The result could feel like a heavy-handed corporate policy rolled out across dozens of branch offices, enforced by auditors who expect obedience. Punishments could be harsh, and local elites who resisted were sidelined. Supporters point out that stronger governance brought order and safer trade. Critics highlight the human cost and loss of local customs. Cultural policies are often framed as a renaissance, yet there's a darker angle there too. Script reforms and educational programs improved record-keeping and helped preserve texts, but they were mainly aimed at the clergy and the royal court. Ordinary people rarely saw those benefits directly. Standardizing liturgy and learning meant local practices were sometimes suppressed or forgotten, like forcing every town to use the same font on its signs, even when the old signs had character. Debates continue over whether the long-term gains in literacy justify the immediate cultural flattening that accompanied them. Finally, the way this legacy has been used in later political storytelling has made clear why rigor matters. Charlemagne has been hailed as a founding father by some modern groups, and that image is convenient for those who want a simple ancestor for complex ideas. Historians warn against that simplification, arguing instead for a balanced view that recognizes both the innovations and the violence. The tidy hero narrative is tempting, like a bestseller biography, but when you look closer you find messy compromises, contested memories, and consequences that mattered to real communities. And as with many great leaders, the debate never really dies, it just gets more nuanced, a little like a family argument that lasts generations and occasionally breaks out at reunions. Charlemagne stitched together a huge chunk of Europe, set up clearer rules for rulers and towns, and pushed schools and art back into the spotlight. Think of him as the manager who reopened the neighborhood library, fixed the road signs, and insisted everyone weigh their apples the same way. He was crowned emperor by the Pope, a medieval spotlight moment, started a wave of learning called the Carolingian Renaissance, basically giving teachers new books and students better classrooms, and left institutions that shaped how Europe ran for centuries. Those ideas weren't perfect and didn't last forever, but they were big steps from chaos towards something more organized. If this story of a school-boosting, road-fixing ruler who sometimes fought with neighbors found you nodding along, or laughing at the medieval office politics, tell us which part surprised you most. Drop a comment with your favorite Charlemagne moment, like the one who tried to standardize handwriting, because even kings hate bad handwriting. If you enjoyed the journey, like and subscribe to see more history served clearly and with a little humor. Next time we'll look at what happened after Charlemagne, how his empire split, the rise of castles and knights, and why everyday people's lives changed. Think of it as the sequel that explains why your town ended up the way it did. See you in the next video.